Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. I'm Nick Messmer, and I'm here with my co-host Kevin Grasso. In this episode, we're talking about Biblical Hebrew verb classes and alternations. So what we're doing today is basically walking through a presentation that Kevin gave at the AAR/SBL annual meeting that took place in San Antonio just a few weeks ago. So we'll include the presentation slides that he used in the show notes for this episode, but we're going to do our best to keep the conversation at a level that doesn't actually require you following along those slides, just in case, you're listening while you're driving or whatever else, but they'll be there as an additional resource. So you begin your presentation with just two kind of big guiding questions for the conversation as a whole. So what are those two questions, and why do you think it's important to kind of have those in mind as we talk through this?
Yeah, so my two big questions that I'm trying to answer are, one, what should be some of our considerations if we try to divide Biblical Hebrew verbs into classes? So, basically, how do we go about doing that? And two, who cares? Why should we go about doing it in the first place? I think the who cares question, is the really foundational answer is so we can get a better understanding of Biblical Hebrew verbs and the language in general, and how it works. And so the question is, does this help us understand, verbs in Biblical Hebrew better? And I think it does. So that's the kind of the short answer to that question. And there's more specific examples on why this matters. But the other question is, how do we go about doing it, is really something that I discussed throughout the presentation. Yeah, it really is something that you have to put into practice and do to get better at.
Yeah. So that first question, kind of the how do we do this? It's a question of methodology, really. And I just think it's an important question because at the end of the day, these classes that we're going to be talking about, they're not handed to us on a silver platter. We're looking at the data and trying to meaningfully group verbs together into these classes. And so, there's a way of doing that productively and a way of doing that maybe not so productively. And so that's why it seems like method is really important there. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why you actually have to get into the data and do it, right? Because there are different ways that in theory you could chunk verbs, right? And if you chunk them in one way, it might tell you something interesting, right? If you chunk them in another way, it might not tell you anything. So the point here is what we're looking for is to divide verbs into classes that tell us something new about how these verbs work.
Right. Awesome. So yeah, those questions will be in mind as we go through it, and maybe we'll kind of return to them at the end and see what we came up with. So kind of the next thing you do is you give a quote from Beth Levine, kind of a theoretical assumption that we have when we go about doing this work. So why don't you read the quote, and I will try to paraphrase it to see if I understand what it's saying.
Yeah. So let me just say that this is from a book that was published in 1993. So at this point, it's pretty dated as far as some of this stuff goes. But there is, it's a good quote for understanding an entire program within linguistics, and really what a whole class of people are doing when they're doing analysis of verbal meanings. So this is what she says. She says, "This work is guided by the assumption that the behavior of a verb, particularly with respect to the expression and interpretation of its arguments, is to a large extent determined by its meaning. Thus, verb behavior can be used effectively to probe for linguistically relevant, pertinent aspects of verb meaning."
So, basically, the semantics of a verb can determine its syntactic properties to some degree, and therefore, the syntactic properties of a verb can help us determine its semantics.
Yeah. So right, exactly. So the idea is that we can look at the syntactic distributions of a verb, and we can learn something about the meaning of the verb.
Awesome. And this is something we've that's been present in previous podcast series and episodes we've done, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. Moving on from there, you provide some examples that help illustrate this theoretical assumption. In English, you give English examples. So, can you share those examples and how they demonstrate this assumption?
Yeah. So this alternation that I discussed first is called the causative and codative alternation, and it's been discussed a ton in the literature. And the prototypical verb for it is break. So you can say something like Nick broke the vase or the vase broke. Then you can contrast that with a sentence like hit or a verb like hit, where you have Nick hit the vase, but you can't say the vase hit. You can say the vase was hit, just like you can say the vase was broke. Or broken. And so you can passivize both of these verbs, right? But there's one alternation, right, or one syntactic frame, we might say, that break allows and hit doesn't. And that's like the vase broke is okay, but the vase hit is not good.
Right. And so what you've just done is described the syntactic distribution of these verbs, and how they differ. And so our theoretical assumption is telling us that based on those syntactic distributions, we can infer something about the semantics of those verbs, which you haven't touched on yet. So how do those syntactic distributions tell us something about the semantics of those verbs?
Right. So then we have to say, okay, what is it about break that's different than hit, right? And the basic idea is that break entails a change of state, and hit does not. So, you can hit something, it doesn't change state at all. But if you break something, then that something is necessarily in a different state, namely a broken one. So that is a semantic difference, right? And the claim is that semantic difference shows up in syntax. And so we can see a split between verbs that entail this change of state, like crack, right? The vase cracked, or Nick cracked the vase. Both of those are okay. Versus, again, something like another verb of touching, like feel. Nick felt the vase felt is bad, right? So it's the idea here is that the verbs that pattern syntactically with break or with hit are going to have that same component of meaning that allows them to alternate or doesn't allow them to alternate.
Right. So the process then that we're getting at, really already getting at kind of a methodology for this, is looking at the data and starting to notice verbs that have similar syntactic distributions. Then you begin to group those into a class. And then you take that class and try to start identifying overlapping aspects of their meaning.
Yeah, exactly. What does this class of verbs have in common? And what do, maybe similar verbs like hit, right? I mean, if you were to say, okay, well, break and hit can be pretty similar. You might hit something in order to break it. Hitting often causes breaking. So you might think like, oh, maybe these are the same class, right? Very similar, could be a very similar event in the world. But how they behave syntactically is quite different, right? So what you have to do then is once you have this class grouped together of verbs, you say, okay, how does this class differ from, the hit class, right? Verbs of feeling or touching. And then you can come up with a hypothesis about the meaning and how that may or may not affect the syntax, right? It's not the case that, that if you might describe a meaningful component, or you might describe one class to mean something or have a certain semantic component that doesn't actually affect the syntax, right? So that's where you have to be careful, and that's where kind of practice helps here, because you begin to see the kinds of patterns that we just find in the world's languages, and they're actually very systematic across languages.
Right. So Beth Levine then gives, at least in your presentation, you share 3 verb classes that she gives, and so I'll share those, and then you can walk us through again the syntactic alternations that are associated with those verb classes and what they tell us about the semantics. So the 3 kind of verb classes she gives, the first one is it's kind of a grouping of roll verbs, break verbs, and bend verbs. And then she gives eat verbs, and then she gives run verbs and ascend verbs as the third one. So why don't you walk us through each of those classes, their syntactic alternations, and the semantic properties?
Yeah, so let me begin by saying that this is like a drop in the bucket of what Levine is doing, right? There's tons of these classes in Levine's work. I just picked out like a couple of them specifically with transitive and transitive, but there's all kinds of other alternations. So you can have a transitive and transitive alternation where the object becomes the subject in one variant. So we saw that with break, right? Nick broke the vase broke. You can do it with other verb classes as well, like roll. So there's a whole group of roll verbs that behave very similar to the verb roll. So you can say something like Rhoda rolled the ball down the hill versus the ball rolled down the hill. Then you have other transitive and transitive alternations, right? Like an eat class, right? And again, this is very, very common across languages. With eat, you can drop the object. So you can just say something like Olivia ate or Olivia ate dinner. And both of those are perfectly okay. Then you can have other syntactic alternations, like one verb has a direct object, and then the next one has a prepositional phrase. So those are like run verbs or ascend verbs. You have examples like Emmett climbed the mountain or Emmett climbed up the mountain. And here you actually do have a difference in meaning. Emmett climbed the mountain entails that Emmett reached the top. Emmett climbed up the mountain could mean that he climbed a little ways and didn't actually reach. He just has to go up from where he started, and it has to be on the mountain slope. So those are the kinds of things that we see in languages, and they're pretty systematic across languages. And again, they help us to see the actual meaning or how the meaning is playing out in syntax.
Right. Yeah. So when you're looking at the data, these syntactic alternations are kind of handed to you on a silver platter in the sense that they're very just objective. It's like this verb, you see it in these environments, and this verb you don't see it in the same environment. So that's really a helpful starting point. And then the work is okay, which verbs can we meaningfully group together based on these, and what can it tell us about the semantics?
Yeah, exactly. And this is exactly why, we can talk more about this later, but this is exactly why I think this is so helpful for Hebrew and Greek, where what we don't have are native speaker judgments about like what these verbs mean, right? What we do have is syntactic distribution. And if the syntactic distribution, right, can tell us something about the meaning, then that's really important to pay careful attention to, what the meaning is allowing for in the syntax.
Right. Okay, so those were some helpful examples, just using English verbs, but let's dive into some actual biblical Hebrew examples. So in your presentation, you start off with again three more examples, but specifically with biblical Hebrew verbs. So you give us 3 verb classes to begin with. You give break verbs. The second one are pasture verbs. And the third one are wash verbs versus eat verbs. So again, kind of break down what are the syntactic alternations we see with these classes, each of these classes, and what does that tell us about the semantics?
Yeah, so these are all, again, like transitive, intransitive alternations, but they might appear differently in Hebrew, or they might have a different source for the alternation. So, for example, the first one I discuss is break verbs, right? And this is what we talked about earlier, with the vase broke versus Nick broke the vase. In Hebrew, this is expressed with kal versus nifal in the binyanim, right? Or stem or template, or however you want to say that.
So we'll probably use binyanim and templates interchangeably, right?
Yeah. So the binyanim are the vowel patterns that roots fit into to make verbs in Hebrew. And sometimes there are consonants as well that are added. But basically, the binyanim can take a transitive verb and make it intransitive, right? That's the idea. And so the binyanim then would be an indicator sometimes of this alternation. And again, this is very common across the world's languages. So you have, for example, in Leviticus 11:33, the variant with kal, ve'oto tishboru. You have the object oto, and then the transitive verb, right? Tishboru, you will break. And then Leviticus 6:21, uchli cheres yishaver. There you have yishaver is the nifal, and it is intransitive, right? So chli cheres is the subject, right? And it's the thing broken. So you have no agent here expressed explicitly. So one question we might ask is, okay, is there an agent, right? And this is actually a really interesting question with biblical Hebrew. In English, for example, we have a three-way contrast with these kinds of verbs that you don't see necessarily in Hebrew. So in English, we can say the vase broke, Nick broke the vase, or the vase was broken. And the difference between the vase was broken and the vase broke is agency, right? So the vase was broken by someone, right? And we know that there is an implicit agent there because we can add like a purpose clause. The vase was broken to get back at, the vase was broken to get back at the wife, right? Something like that.
Or you could just say by. The vase was broken by.
Right. Yeah. Whereas if you say the vase broke to get back at her, right? Or the vase broke by the man, right? It's terrible. So in Hebrew, we actually don't have morphology that distinguishes between those two readings. In English, we do. Not morphology per se in English, but we at least have a passive, right? An auxiliary verb added. So the idea is that nifal can be either, and you actually have examples of this. You have examples where, Genesis 9:11, for example, is an example where the by, you have a by phrase, right? And so the idea is that this class in nifal behaves either like the vase broke or the vase was broken.
Right. So what's really interesting here is you have this syntactic alternation, the transitive and transitive alternation, where the object becomes the subject. And when you have an object, it's in the call, and when you don't, when it becomes a subject, it's in the nifal. So what's really interesting is you have another class of verbs that have the same transitive and transitive alternation where the object becomes the subject, but in both cases, the verb is in the call. So that's interesting because It's kind of one additional layer, right? Where you might put those verbs in the same class because they have the same alternation, but you do see a distinction with the binyanim, and so it's actually helpful to break them into two classes. So why don't you talk about that second class that's call in both alternations?
Right. So in that class, I mean, in this example in Hebrew, right, we would say, okay, well, because you can see a difference actually in the morphology, right? Hebrew is telling us, okay, this is not the same class, right? Because in one case you have a call nifal alternation, and in this case you have a call. So these kinds of verbs, I call pasture verbs. They seem to always involve a locative argument, and I have just a small list of them. But the pasture actually in English was an old verb. It's not really used anymore, but it undergoes the same alternation. A shepherd can pasture his sheep, or the sheep can pasture, and we don't really use the verb today. We just don't have good intuitions about whether you can say that or not. But if you look it up, it's legit. So the idea here is that you have an example like Exodus 34:3, Gam hatzon vehabakar al yir'u, and this is where the tzon and bakar are the sheep and the cattle. They are going to be the ones pasturing, right? And so in that case, it's intransitive. And then we have in Exodus 30:31, Ashuva er'e tzoncha. So here we have the er'e is I will pasture, right? Tzoncha, right? Your sheep, or your flock, right? And so that's transitive. Both are in kal. So again, what is really interesting here is like why do break verbs require a new binyan for this seemingly identical alternation, right? Transitive and transitive, object becomes a subject, and this other class of verbs for whatever reason licenses this without changing binyanim, right? That tells us something fundamentally about these roots. I mean, it doesn't tell us anything, right? But it does tell us there's a semantic distinction between them. And my suggestion is that it is actually has to do with these roots have to do with locations, and that's the difference. It gets much more complex than that, but that's the basic idea.
Right. So the first class where it's the call nifal alternation, the semantic property that's common across those verbs in that class is a change of state, that we've talked about, whereas the semantic property that's common across the verbs with the same syntactic alternation but morphologically it's a call, those have to do with location rather than change of state, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a lot of there's the syntax, but then there's also the morphology layer. Now both of those together tell us something about the semantics of the verb.
Right, exactly. And if you were to just compare this to English, right, you might be tempted to collapse these two classes together, because in English we actually don't have a morphological difference, right? Because you can just say the sheep pastured, and the shepherd pastured the sheep, and the vase broke and Nick broke the vase, right? So in those two alternations, they look identical on the surface, right? But then when we go to Hebrew, we say, oh, okay, like actually maybe there is a different semantic property between these two classes that's causing this binyanim shift in one class and not in the other class, and English in general, right, is very impoverished morphologically, and so that's really to be expected in a lot of ways, but that's why it's so helpful to look at other languages to see how these same classes are divided up, both in the syntax and in the morphology. And it's also interesting to note, right, that again, the same class of verbs alternate in both languages, right? Which again tells us something about the fact that, like, for whatever reason, as humans, we are allowing this syntactic alternation because of some semantic property that holds across languages.
Okay, so that covers the first two classes you give, the break verbs and the pasture verbs. And then you give one more with wash verbs versus eat verbs. So what's going on there?
Yeah, so the idea here is you have the same alternation again. So you can drop the object. So again, in English, right, we can say something like, my daughter washed before dinner, which means that, that we don't have a subject, an object, right? It's intransitive. It means that she washed herself, right? Either her hands or her whole body or something. Versus you can just say, my daughter ate, and that, again, is intransitive. And we understand the object to be, something edible normally. So the idea here is that both of these verbs allow for you to drop the object without any indication in the morphology of the verb, that the object has disappeared, right? So you have an example of this in 2 Samuel 12:20. Vayakom David mehaaretz vayirchatz, right? Vayirchatz is understood in that context to mean David washed himself, right? And then you have an example of the eat verbs from Genesis 3:6. Vatikach mi perio vatochal. So vatochal, right, is clear from the context that it's the fruit that was just taken, right? But it's not present syntactically. So the idea here is that there are different reasons why we might drop an object. The 2 Samuel 12:20 is pretty interesting because vayirchatz isn't normally how you would say that in in modern Hebrew, for example. In modern Hebrew, you would make the reflexive explicit. So if you wanted to say you washed yourself, it would be hitrachetz with the hitpael, binyan. So there you do have a morphological difference, right? In contrast, the eat verb, right, will always be in kal. You'll never. It's not reflexive in any way, and you can just drop the object. And so there, again, we might be tempted to say, okay, these two sets of verbs are in the same class, right? Because in both cases you can drop the object. But here, modern Hebrew tells us that maybe not, right? Maybe you can drop the object for a different reason, right? But what's interesting, actually, though, in both cases, they're just understood objects, right? Just they are, like a reflexive object. I washed himself, or like I washed myself, or something that's eaten, right? These are objects that are like prototypically associated with these kinds of events, right? And so the idea here is that Biblical Hebrew actually does tell us something interesting about this, right? The fact that these are both lumped together, right, means that, in both cases, when we have these sorts of events that are prototypically associated with certain kinds of objects, you don't need the object present at all. So again, that's why it's helpful to look at multiple languages and see, how these things are divided up.
Okay, so that whole discussion kind of leads us to the next big section of your presentation, where what we started to notice with those examples is that there are kind of different factors that can signal that there's a semantic property overlap across these verbs that we're putting into classes together. So the call-nifal alternation versus the call-call alternation, there it's the binyanim that are signaling that these are two distinct verb classes, right? So kind of in the next part of your presentation, you give kind of other elements that kind of factor into all of this. So you talk about binyanim as one of them, and then you also talk about roots, and you talk about voice. So maybe we can just walk through each of those, and you can kind of talk about how these factor into how we analyze these verb classes. So maybe start with roots is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, it is the root of the matter.
Yeah.
Sorry, bad joke. So yeah, the idea here with roots, right, is So Hebrew has roots that are very transparent. Okay, so root is just the lexical core of the word. English has roots too. The hypothesis is that every language has roots. Now they appear differently in different languages. So the idea is that when we have an alternation, like the past year verbs, right, where you have two syntactic variants, both in kal, right, with the same root, same binyan, right. The only thing that can be possibly licensing that variation can be the root, right? So because you have the same binyan, right? That's the idea. So if you compare that to the kal nifal, right? In that case, we can say that the nifal is actually suppressing the subject, right? And so those kinds of roots, right, allow for nifal to suppress the subject, and other kinds of roots may not allow for nifal at all, or might have might allow for the subject to drop without the binyan change. So that's the basic idea. Like it might be helpful to take a closer look at achal and what that does in biblical Hebrew. So the idea is, right, that when the object is just understood, it's a prototypical object, right, and you have a verb that describes the action and not the change of state. So achal does not necessarily give you the change of state, right? It just gives you it refers to the action of physically eating in the world, right? Shavad doesn't tell you anything about how something is broken, right? It gives you the result state. So achal is interesting because you have examples in biblical Hebrew that actually do require a result state, where it's used as something like destroy, right? And the very typical subject here with this sense is with esh, right? The fire, devoured is how it's normally translated, or something like that. The idea is that actually when you look, when you have something like ha'esh achla something, right, you actually always have something there. So the argument is always present. So when you have the meaning of achal as devour, you have to have the argument there. When you have the meaning of achal as just eat, you can drop the object, and it's actually dependent upon the semantics of the subject. If the subject is animate, it can just refer to the action of eating. If it's inanimate or a causer, causers don't do the action of eating, so you have to have an actual result. And people know this, like this is just like a pretty standard thing that agents behave differently than causers, and so that tells us something, right, about the root achal, right? It tells us that it allows for animate subjects, and so it probably points to an event in the real world, but because it also allows for inanimate subjects, it is associated with this with this change of state. That change of state is necessarily present when you have an inanimate subject, a causer, and it may be present when you have an agent.
Right. So
the basic idea with roots, right, is that if it doesn't show up in the binyan, then it has to be something about the root that it's allowing for the alternation. Yeah, so once you recognize that, what you then have to do is you have to take that whole class of verbs that will that do alternate without changing binyan. you have to say, okay, like what does this class have in common, right? And that's where like I suggested it's locative verbs, right? Or it's verbs with a location of some kind. And for whatever reason that is licensing this sort of alternation, it so happens that verbs with locations actually do behave uniquely across languages. So that is suggestive that, we're on the right track. It's not an answer. It's a start to an analysis.
Right. So the difference between shavar and achal here is that shavar, they have different syntactic alternations. With shavar and just break verbs in general, it's accounted for or signaled by the change in binyanim from kal to nifal. But with the other class of verbs where like achal, there is no change in binyanim, and so something about the root itself is allowing for the alternation without a change in binyanim. Right. That's basically what's going on.
Right. Okay. Right. Exactly.
So other verbs in this class with achal that have the same alternation, you could make that same claim about them, about like allowing for animate subjects and inanimate subjects, and the distinction between an agent and a causer.
Well, see, and this is where things start to get dicey, right? Like achal, you can say allows for both of those. If you look at a verb like rachatz, like I don't know. I mean, you'd have to check this in biblical Hebrew whether the that's actually allowed. Whether you have inanimate subjects with rachatz, I don't know. But the idea is that if you did, you would expect to see that same sort of alternation where you have a cause or subject necessarily entails a change in the object, right? And you can say this in English, right? The rain washed the car, means it had to have gotten cleaner, whereas my kids washed the car could very well mean that it's much dirtier now than when they started. And so like you do see that, but the question is, even that semantic property, even that semantic similarity, or that syntactic similarity, doesn't necessarily mean that these are the same class, right? So this is where you have to be very careful, right? Like we said, posture verbs seem to undergo some of the same alternations as break verbs, but does that mean they're the same class? No. And the same thing with achal and rachatz, like maybe they're the same class. Maybe there's a broader category of understood objects. But again, this is part of just doing the analysis, right? And how fine-grained you want to be. It's not the case that every time you see the same syntactic alternation, it's gonna, you can say that they're in the same class, because there could be two different semantic components that are allowing for the same syntactic alternation, right? That's the key.
Right. Okay. Got it. That's helpful. So that's good on roots. So again, just showing how roots play a role in classifying verbs into classes. So the second thing that you cover then, which we've touched on some, are binyanim, or what you call templates. So how do those factor into our analysis?
Yeah. So without getting too deep into what in the world of binyan is, or a template, basically the idea is that binyanim are, either voice or what's called a verbalizer. So a verbalizer is, if you guessed what that word means, it verbifies something, right? It makes something into a verb. And I'm actually using all of these, suffixes, like verbify. The if-I suffix, turns things into verbs in English, right? It is a verbalizer. It usually takes like an adjective. So a prototypical one, like justify, we have just as an adjective, if you add the if-I suffix, it turns into a verb, right? The idea here is that the binyanim can do different things, right? And one of the things that they can do, right, is they can take they can take other words, or specifically other verbs, and turn them into verbs, right? With different semantic properties. So he feel is an example of this, right? You have rats, which is run, and heritz is, make run. Okay, and so what's happening there is you have an activity verb in kal, right? And the idea is that he feel sees that activity verb and says, okay, I'm gonna add a causer to it, make someone run. And so that's what he feel can do. It doesn't always do that. But the idea here is that is a syntactic alternation, right? Run versus make run. You have an extra participant, the causer, the one who's making someone else run. That's added, by the binyan he feel, right? Not there in call, is there in he feel. And the idea is that he feel, whatever semantics it gives you, allows for that extra argument, right? Just like justify, actually adds another argument as well, right? You have just, you can just say, that man is just, right? Where it's just that man has the property of being just, but when, the judge justifies that man, the judge is a new participant, right? And he is declaring or, considering that man to be in the state of being just.
Right. So you touched on this going back to Shavar again, where you said that, again, it's not the root that accounts for necessarily the syntactic alternation, but because you have a call nifal alternation, that perhaps indicates that it's the binyanim that accounts for it. And so in that case, you said that the nifal suppresses the subject. So in the call, you have two arguments, subject and the object, but in the nifal, it suppresses the original subject, the person doing the breaking. So then you just have, the vase broke. And so that in that instance, nifal is suppressing an argument, whereas hifil is introducing a third argument. Right. So that's what accounts. So in those examples, the binyanim are accounting for the different syntactic alternations. Is that right?
Right. And so, you have to be, really careful here, right? Because he feel doesn't always introduce new arguments. And so what that means is, right, that he feel with some roots will introduce a new argument. So the question is, like, why, right? What do those roots have in common that necessitates, a new argument when he feel is added, right? And then there are other roots that don't allow, that are just completely intransitive in he feel, right? Hishkim is one of them. There's no call variant. Hishkim just means got up. It's usually got up early or something. You see all the time in the Bible, Vayashkem Avraham, right? Abraham got up early, right? And there's no causer, there's nothing there, right? I mean, it's intransitive. He got up. And so the idea is that, whatever semantics we need to give to he feel, it should allow for new arguments in some verbs. In other verbs, it requires new arguments. And in other verbs, it's just completely intransitive. So, again, it just like the if-I suffix or the en suffix in English, it's doing something semantic. It's changing something into a verb. That's what he feel does. And that has syntactic implications.
Right. So just taking a step back really quickly to think again a little bit about method. And I think really importantly, our method shouldn't be like linear. It's kind of a cyclical process of like, beginning to classify verbs and then going back to the data. Like we saw, these maybe appear to be in the same class, but if we look further, they're different classes. But just for simplifying it, going to think about it a little bit like a linear process. You look at the data, you begin to identify different syntactic properties of different verbs. Then you can kind of begin to classify them according to those syntactic properties. And then kind of the next step would be looking at how those verbs that you've classified together based on syntactic properties maybe have overlapping semantic properties. But then kind of the additional step is then looking at roots and Binyanim to see how they signal, why one class might have one syntactic alternation versus another. So,
right, and the roots in the Binyanim actually help us to explain what's going on, right? They're not just like a note. Okay, great, like we have this alternation, right? But the question is, why, right? And so the Binyanim, these Binyanim contribute a meaning, right? And so the question is like, what do they mean, right? And that will help us to figure out, what verbs in he field, for example, actually mean. And roots, contribute meaning. And so the idea is that, like, okay, if we say that this syntactic alternation is, a reflection of a semantic property, where's that property? It's in the roots. Or it's in the things that give us meaning, right? So it's in the roots of the Binyanim, right? That's the idea.
Right. Awesome. So that's a really good segue to how you wrap up your presentation. You give some applications and conclusions. And so again, this is kind of circling all the way back to some of our big questions. Our first big question about like, how do we, go about grouping verbs into verb classes? We've kind of been talking about the whole time, methodology. But then the second big question is why? What's the payoff? Why does it matter? So you just started to get at that. What are some of the other, reasons? What are examples? What are some of the other ways we get kind of payoff from this process?
Yeah. So the three, applications or conclusions I give, for the payoff are, these three are really, there's more, right? There's just the very basic thing that we discussed earlier is just a better understanding of what, verbs are doing. And I think that can be seen across the board. But you also have, particularly in Hebrew, right, where we have so little data, it can help us kind of bolster our data in some ways. So, for example, there are odd examples of common verbs, right? So Exodus 14:10 is one of these. It says para'o hikriv, right? And hikriv is normally, he brought something near. So you have the adjective karov, right, to be near. Add the hifil, and really the call variant as well, right? It just means to be near. Add the hifil, right? It normally means brought near. It's normally used for sacrifices, etc. And so, the idea is that the hifil, it looks like, is adding that extra argument that we've seen. The problem is that, you find an example like Exodus 14:10, and there is no extra argument. Para'o hikriv. And so it's like, okay, what Pharaoh, did he bring something near, right? Or did he come near? And so the problem is when you have so little data, it's very hard, to make like solid conclusions from one or two examples, right? You might suggest an emendation, right? Or you might suggest bad Hebrew, right? Or something like that, or just a really odd use. But actually, when you look at this class of verbs, these are degree achievements, and we didn't really touch on this, but the idea is that there's this whole class of verbs in Hefil that are derived from adjectival-like roots, and they behave the same way, right? They have this alternation. They don't change Binyanim. They alternate, between the between a transitive and intransitive. And so this is expected, right? As long as you see this verb as a member of that class, which it is, then it's would be totally normal to have this alternation. So, a couple of the other verbs, for example, are, herchiv, right? To widen, can be used with or without an object, right? Either the thing widened or someone widened the thing. And actually in English, it's the same thing. And so the idea here is that this just helps us to account for, this example that, many people have seen as very weird. You can also have like better hypotheses for the meaning of uncommon verbs. So, another example here is lehaktin or hiktin, right? To make small. So again, once you recognize that this is part of a class of verbs that do something very similar, you can say, okay, well, even if I only have one or two examples of this, which we only do have one or two examples of this verb, we can have a good idea of what it means just because it fits this class, right? So what we would expect about hiktin is it can undergo the same alternation, get smaller or make smaller. It is related to the adjective katon or katan, right? And it has all the same properties, right, that we would expect of a similar verb like higdil, right? To get bigger or make bigger. And lastly, we can just have a better understanding of the binyanim. And this is something that, there's a lot of work that can be done here. And the binyanim are hugely important for understanding verbs in general because all of the verbs run through the binyan system, right? So if we can have a better understanding of what kal is doing, of what pl is doing, of what hifil is doing, right? Then we can have a better understanding of what, the whole class of verbs in kal are doing, right? Or hifil or pl or whatever. And that just allows us to, not make exegetical mistakes, but hopefully it gives us some insight as well into, into the language and ultimately into the word.
Right. Yeah. So just as we kind of wrap up here, I would recommend we kind of get into verb arguments and alternations a good bit in our series on lexical semantics. So that's kind of a good place to go, especially our episodes on Hebrew. So we did one with Malka, Rappaport, Hovav, and we get into verb arguments, alternations, classes. We kind of get into all of that in that episode from a kind of linguistic standpoint. But other episodes in that series as well. But yeah, just in terms of applications, we kind of talked about it in that series as well. Like some of these analyses maybe seem small or like really fine grained, but they really do kind of build, like you might notice something small about a particular verb class, but that kind of tells you something about the language as a whole. So in that episode, we were talking about like locative verbs and all of that, and kind of small things or seemingly small things, but then that kind of led to like, oh, Hebrew is a verb framed language, like as a whole. It was kind of a big finding that so really one of our applications from that series in general is like it's just important to approach the language with kind of a sense of humility. Like it's different than our native language, and it's important to know really as many quote unquote small features of that language as we possibly can as we kind of put together the big picture of the language as well. So
maybe just to add, again, a lot of the words that we've talked about, like break, and eat, are like not the words people run to as the most theologically significant, like you said. But if you don't really know why eat's behaving the way it is or why break is behaving the way it is, then you're not going to have much of a shot at an abstract word, right? And you've got it, like, you have to start with the, very concrete words that we've studied a lot in linguistics in general, right? And we already have a good idea of what they're doing across languages. I did my dissertation on like verbs of judgment, right? And there's like so little literature on that within linguistics. And so the problem is you are in a lot of ways like starting from scratch, right? You're kind of like developing a theory and, for what these things are doing. And so the problem is, what I have found personally, I should just say that I found it very helpful to start with words that I knew and that I had a lot of data for, in order to develop my theory of what the Binyanim system is doing, for example. And then I applied that to verbs that are much more difficult, verbs that, are abstract and that are more theologically loaded oftentimes, but for which we don't have the best intuitions for.
Awesome.
For which we don't have the best intuitions.
Well, that's good. That is all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.